Their boots left muddy tracks across the compound as they moved in silent formation. Uniforms creased and stained from endless nights sleeping rough, their eyes never stopped scanning, searching for the danger they'd been promised would come. The fighting had ceased, but terror remained lodged deep in their chests. These young German women, communications workers for the Wehrmacht, faced the most frightening unknown of all: what happens after surrender. In the final days before their capture, their commanding officers had painted vivid pictures of American brutality. Stories of torture, degradation, perhaps even execution circulated through their ranks. Every whispered tale made capture seem worse than death itself. Now, in the closing days of May 1945, somewhere in the Bavarian highlands, they shuffled through the gates of an American 7th Army detention facility outside Bad Aibling. The silence among them was absolute. Fear had stolen their voices. A young woman named Erica pulled her coat tighter around her body, though the fabric offered little comfort against the dread churning in her stomach. She leaned toward her companion and breathed words barely audible. "They'll humiliate us. They'll let us starve." Her friend couldn't summon the strength to disagree. Exhaustion had drained them both beyond the capacity for hope. The column halted before a group of American soldiers. The women braced themselves for violence, for mockery, for the beginning of horrors they'd been trained to expect. Instead, they heard something unexpected. Clipped commands in accented German ordering them to form lines. A medical inspection would come first. The women exchanged confused glances. An inspection, not the abuse they'd been conditioned to anticipate. Medical staff wearing white armbands appeared with clipboards and supplies ready. Each woman underwent examination. Eyes checked for infection, arms inspected for signs of parasites, hair combed through methodically for lice. The process felt cold, mechanical, yet each gesture tightened the knots in their stomachs further. Then came the delousing powder. Fine white clouds settled onto their clothing, into their hair, against their skin. Some coughed violently, others gagged on the dust. Erica frantically brushed at her blouse, convinced she was being poisoned. "What are you doing to us?" she cried, her voice breaking with panic. A nurse responded in halting German. "For lice. You're safe. Just lice treatment." The line continued moving forward. At the next station, the truly unexpected order came. A soldier gestured toward a row of makeshift enclosures where steam rose from metal fixtures. "Everyone showers, now." The word struck like a physical blow. A ripple of whispered horror passed through the group. "Showers," someone repeated, the syllable heavy with suspicion. Another woman grabbed her neighbor's sleeve and whispered urgently, "Is it real, or is it something else entirely?" They had all heard the rumors from the Eastern Territories, terrifying stories whispered late at night about facilities where showers weren't showers at all. Fear closed around their throats like a fist. Yet the guards seemed completely unconcerned, almost bored with the routine. Bars of rough greenish-brown soap were distributed. Erica held hers like it was something alien, studying the stamped letters that read U.S. Army pressed into the surface. She brought it close to her face and inhaled. Sharp, harsh, chemical, but unmistakably soap. The queue shuffled forward. Steam fogged the air, condensing on metal pipes and dripping in steady rhythm. They could hear water striking concrete floors. The sound was so ordinary, so domestic, yet to them it represented pure terror. "This is a trick," one voice hissed through the steam. Another muttered bitterly, "Why would they waste water on prisoners?" At the threshold of the shower stalls, hesitation rippled through the entire group. Some women stopped moving entirely, refusing to advance until guards gestured more insistently. Others shuffled slowly inside, trembling as they began removing their filthy uniforms. For years, they had subsisted on inadequate rations, survived constant bombardment, lived surrounded by lies about their enemies. To stand exposed before strangers, clutching bars of foreign soap, felt like stepping into an abyss. Then a valve turned. Water poured from the pipes. It wasn't gas, it wasn't deception, It was hot water, genuinely hot, hissing against skin that hadn't felt real warmth in weeks. Soap lathered between fingers, suds streaked down arms and legs. Weeks of accumulated grime and parasites washed away in gray rivulets pooling at their feet. Some wept quietly as the truth settled over them. This was real. The Americans had provided soap and functioning showers. For just a moment, shame mingled intensely with relief. Shame at their own suspicions, shame at how completely their nation had collapsed, and relief so profound it bordered on pain. One girl whispered through her tears, "It's only water." Another answered in a choked voice, "Yes, only water." But relief didn't erase the reality of captivity. The guards remained outside, waiting. Their old lives, their uniforms, their duties, their orders, all of it was gone. Ahead stretched weeks, perhaps years, behind barbed wire. Yet standing in that steam-filled enclosure, rinsing away the accumulated filth of retreat, they understood something crucial. Defeat didn't necessarily mean annihilation. The shock of hot water and the scent of soap cut through their fear more effectively than any propaganda speech ever could. In that small, mundane act of enforced hygiene, something fundamental shifted in their understanding of what was happening. This wasn't mercy, it wasn't luxury, it was simply procedure. But procedure was enough to demonstrate that the rules governing this new existence would differ completely from everything they'd been told to expect. Yet to truly understand the weight of their fear and the significance of this moment, we need to trace back to the collapse itself, to the road that brought them to the shower stall. By May 1945, Germany was disintegrating in every direction imaginable. In the Bavarian uplands, the Third Reich's final days weren't marked by glorious last stands or heroic resistance, but by chaos, starvation, and the constant sound of retreat. Villages that once displayed banners and hosted parades now stood hollow and silent, broken only by endless columns of soldiers trudging southward, desperate to avoid the advancing Soviet forces. For the young women serving in the Wehrmacht's auxiliary communications service, life had narrowed to an exhausting blur of telephone connections, garbled messages, and partially overheard orders. Many had joined not from ideological fervor because the war had consumed every aspect of existence. One girl, Marta, had taken her position at 16 after her father's conscription. She worked at Munich's central telephone exchange, connecting calls between officers. By the end, the phones rang ceaselessly, with reports of disintegration. Units cut off, roads blocked, cities reduced to rubble. The propaganda still blared from radios, though it no longer bore any resemblance to observable reality. Posters proclaimed final victory, while the women witnessed retreat with their own eyes. Every railway station overflowed with refugees, clutching bundles of bedding. Mothers dragged children by their hands, old men limped on walking sticks. Wounded soldiers slumped on benches with vacant stares. American aircraft roared overhead, strafing columns on the roads. The women whispered to each other during their shifts. If they're already this close, where is the promised army that will save us? When Munich fell in late April, shock rippled through their ranks. Many received orders to move south toward the foothills, told to maintain communications for units that had ceased to exist. By the time they reached the Bad Aibling area, their uniforms were stained with sweat and travel dust. The war that had once seemed distant was collapsing directly beneath their feet. Rumors filled the vacuum left by actual orders. Some claimed the Americans would execute female auxiliary workers on sight, punishing them for serving Hitler's military. Others whispered darker tales from the east about mass violence and retaliation as the Red Army swept through occupied territories. For these women, surrender felt like gambling with their lives. Each night during the march, they huddled together in abandoned barns or empty schoolhouses, trading fears and hushed tones. Better to discard the uniforms, one girl urged. They'll think we're ordinary civilians. And if they discover we lied, another countered, that could be even worse.
The group decided almost wordlessly to keep their uniforms. It was a strange badge, serving as both shame and protection simultaneously. If the Americans captured them, at least they could claim they hadn't concealed the truth. Hunger intensified their dread. The last field kitchens had been abandoned miles back. Their bread rations had vanished. They chewed raw turnips pulled from gardens or shared crusts traded with desperate villagers. By the time the American patrol spotted them, most were too weakened to resist. Hands rose not in defiance, but in trembling surrender, born of exhaustion. The Americans moved efficiently. They confiscated weapons the women didn't possess. They cataloged names. They herded everyone toward the wire enclosures. But even then, fear clung tight. Erica later recalled that she had mentally rehearsed her own death, waiting for the moment when rifles would be turned against them. Instead, they were told to walk. Walk and keep walking until the gates of the detention facility closed behind them. Inside, everything appeared both strange and ordinary simultaneously. Tents stood in neat rows, soldiers carried clipboards, barbed wire ringed the entire space. This wasn't the image of chaos they'd been warned about. It looked almost organized. That sense of order, however, did little to calm their nerves. The war had taught them that appearances often concealed something far worse. The women clung to each other as names were recorded, ages noted, details written down by Americans speaking halting German or working through interpreters. They were simply entries on forms now, numbers on sheets, faces to be processed. The strangeness of being reduced to paperwork struck them forcefully. Still, compared to the road behind them, something here felt different. No bombs, no strafing aircraft, no collapsing buildings. The silence of captivity felt heavy, but it wasn't the chaos of the front lines. For a brief moment, standing behind wire with their meager belongings at their feet, they realized they were alive, and survival itself now carried its own peculiar weight. But survival was only the beginning. The moment of first genuine contact with the Americans would challenge every belief they'd been conditioned to hold about their captors. The first real encounter came not with violence or insults, but with orders delivered in flat, matter-of-fact tones. When the gates clanged shut behind them, at Bad Aibling, the women braced for humiliation. Instead, they saw rows of tents, supply crates stacked efficiently, and soldiers moving with the same discipline they might have used in their own German barracks. It wasn't kindness, but it wasn't cruelty either. The guards were young, many no older than the women themselves. Their uniforms showed dust from the road. Helmets sat low, rifles hung across their chests. They didn't sneer or mock. They treated the group like one more task to be completed, one more set of bodies to account for in a war that had dragged on far too long. That, in its own way, proved more unnerving than insults would have been. The women had expected rage. What they received was indifference. "Form a line," an American sergeant called, his accent thick but his words sharp. An interpreter beside him repeated the order in German. The women shuffled into rows, hugging themselves against the chill. Their boots scraped the dirt. For the first time since surrendering, they lifted their eyes. One girl, Annalise, whispered, "They don't even look at us, as if we're nothing." Another muttered back, "Maybe that's better." The sergeant's questions came rapidly. Name, age, unit, place of capture. Each answer was recorded, each voice measured and filed away. To the women, it felt like standing before a judge who cared little for guilt or innocence. Their entire identity was reduced to words scrawled in a ledger. After paperwork came the collection of possessions. Pockets were emptied, scarves, watches, even small lockets were taken, tagged, and stored. It stung not because of the loss itself, but because it represented the stripping away of the last remnants of normal life. Marta's locket held a photograph of her brother, killed on the Eastern Front. It was dropped into a canvas bag. She nearly reached to snatch it back, but the cold stare of the guard stopped her. Then the first sliver of humanity appeared. A soldier, sorting through the pile of belongings, noticed Marta's trembling. He paused, held up the locket, and in hesitant German said, "Picture? Family?" She nodded, lips pressed tight. He studied it briefly, then slipped it into a smaller pouch marked with her name, ensuring she would receive it back later. No smile, no warmth, just a small gesture of procedure carried out with a touch of care. It caught Marta off guard more than anything else that day. The women were led to a sectioned area with straw on the ground. Guards stood at the perimeter, rifles slung but not aimed. The prisoners sat in silence, knees pulled to their chests, glancing nervously at their captors. Every sound amplified their unease. The creak of boots, the crack of a rifle strap, the murmur of English words they couldn't understand. As night descended, they received tin cups filled with watery stew and hunks of bread. The food was coarse, but after days of hunger, it tasted almost unreal. Erica tore at hers in silence, then muttered, "This is more than we had last week." Her friend whispered back, "Don't say it out loud, they might hear." Over the following hours, the realization grew that these Americans weren't acting from hatred. They were operating under regulations. Guards rotated shifts, meals arrived at regular intervals, the women were watched closely but not harassed. The camp ran with an order that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the retreat they had left behind. Still, suspicion lingered. "It could change tomorrow," one prisoner said. "They could decide we're worthless than this bread." The others nodded, clinging to their doubts like armor. The first contact hadn't broken them, but it had unsettled the narrative they had carried in their minds. The enemy was supposed to sneer, to strike, to treat them less than human. Instead, they were logged, sorted, and fed. It wasn't kindness, but it wasn't cruelty. It was something in between, and that was almost harder to comprehend. But if this initial encounter tested their expectations, the processing that followed, the inspections, and the strange rituals of hygiene would shake them even more profoundly. Morning arrived with a whistle and the heavy thud of boots on packed earth. The prisoners stirred from uneasy sleep, straw clinging to their uniforms, hair tangled, mouths dry. They expected shouting or violence, but what greeted them instead was another set of orders. "All prisoners, line up, medical inspection today." The women obeyed, though their steps were heavy with suspicion. They formed a ragged column, waiting as American soldiers set up tables stacked with papers, boxes of supplies, and metal canisters that hissed faintly. The sight of the canisters sparked alarm. Whispers raced through the line. "What is that? Chemicals? Poison?" Their fear intensified as memories of whispered stories from the East pressed into their minds. At the head of the line, a U.S. Army doctor adjusted his spectacles, clipboard in hand. Nurses in white armbands moved briskly, speaking to each other in English. The scene had the air of routine, but for the women, every gesture carried menace. The inspection began. Each woman stepped forward, her name checked against the roster. Her eyes and skin examined for signs of disease, gloves snapped against wrists, thermometers were used, foreheads touched. The women flinched at every moment. Marta, shivering, tried to explain through broken words that she was healthy, but the medic barely looked up, jotting notes as if she were no different from hundreds before her. Then came the delousing. Soldiers opened the canister, shaking fine white powder over the women's heads and shoulders. The dust clung to their hair, their uniforms, their skin. They coughed violently, waving their hands in panic. Erica cried out, "What are you doing?" An interpreter standing nearby answered quickly in German, "For lice, not poison. Lice." The explanation calmed some, but not all. The humiliation of being dusted like livestock cut deep. One girl, Katerina, turned to her friend and whispered bitterly, "This is how they show we're nothing, not even worth clean hands." Her friend stared at the ground silently, relieved it hadn't been gas.
After the powdering, they were ordered to strip down to underclothes for a full inspection. The shame was suffocating. To be exposed under the gaze of strangers felt like another form of defeat. A few tried to cover themselves with torn coats until guards barked at them to move faster. One nurse checked hair for lice with a comb, pulling it through strands as the women clenched their fists in humiliation. And yet, even in this degrading process, there was an odd sense of order.
The nurses spoke softly, almost indifferently, never mocking. The soldiers kept their distance, eyes averted when possible. It wasn't kindness, but it wasn't the cruelty they'd braced for. It was clinical, as though they were simply problems to be solved. Once the inspections ended, the women were handed worn towels and pointed toward the stalls. Steam drifted upward, carrying the unmistakable sound of rushing water. The guards pressed soap into their hands, coarse olive-colored bars with U.S. Army stamped across them. The word spread quickly down the line. Showers. Marta clutched her bar of soap like a weapon, whispering to Erica, "Do you believe it? Hot water after all this?" Erica shook her head, unable to answer. The fear was still there, rising like bile. Too many stories had poisoned their minds. Showers, they had been told, could mean death. The line inched forward. The steam thickened. They could hear splashes, dripping, the echo of women's voices from inside the stalls. Some sounded startled, others almost relieved. Those waiting outside exchanged anxious looks, each wondering if this was truly safe. When it was finally Marta's turn, her legs trembled as she stepped inside. She peeled off her uniform, clutching the soap tightly, bracing for the worst. A soldier turned the valve, and water sprayed down in steady streams. Marta gasped. It was hot, real, scalding, cleansing hot water. She rubbed the soap between her hands, foam formed. The grime of weeks on the road washed down her arms in gray streaks. Her body shook, not from fear now, but from something she could barely name. Relief. Around her, other women began to wash. Tentatively at first, then with urgency. Tears mixed with soap suds. The water carried away not only the dirt of retreat, but also the poison of expectation. Still, it was not easy to accept. Inside the row of makeshift stalls, steam clouded the air, turning shapes into silhouettes. The women stood in awkward silence, clutching soap, their backs to one another. Some moved quickly, scrubbing furiously, as if the water might stop at any moment. Others froze, eyes shut tight, waiting for something terrible to happen. Marta, her shoulders hunched, whispered, "It feels wrong to be naked here, in front of them, like we're animals." Erica answered, voice trembling, "At least the water is real." The soap foamed easily, its sharp, earthy scent filling the air. For the Americans, it was just another bar from a supply crate, indistinguishable from thousands handed out to soldiers. But to these women, it was a revelation. They rubbed it over arms, faces, legs, watching the dirt dissolve into streaks that swirled down the drains. The sound of rushing water grew louder, and with it came a strange release. One girl, Anna, leaned against the wall, tears mixing with the spray. She whispered to no one in particular, "I thought this was the end. I thought they were going to kill us." No one answered, but several heads bowed in silent agreement. The fear was real, sharpened by propaganda and whispers of atrocities. And yet, here they were, washing with American soap. The guards outside called out occasionally, their voices muffled by the steam. They weren't shouting threats, only reminding the women to move along. Nurses passed towels through the entrance, their hands brisk, eyes fixed on the task rather than the prisoners' bodies. It was strangely impersonal, like an assembly line. For some, this indifference was harder to grasp than cruelty would have been. And Elise muttered bitterly, "We're nothing to them, just work to be done." But even she could not deny the relief in her voice when she admitted, "At least they don't look at us the way we were told they would." The process was quick. 10 minutes, maybe less, before each woman stepped out, dripping and red-skinned, clutching a towel. The nightmarish fear of poison faded with each new group that returned alive and clean. Soon the whispers shifted from suspicion to disbelief. "Do you think they care about us?" "No, it's just their rules." But even rules can have meaning. The showers became more than hygiene. They were proof that the war was not the only truth they had known. For years, they had been told the Allies would destroy them utterly, show no mercy, treat them as vermin. And yet, here they were, alive, cleaner than they had been in months, their bodies humming from the shock of heat and soap. Still, the relief came laced with shame. Many of the women had believed the propaganda, repeated it to others, built their lives around its lies. To realize that the enemy followed rules, even in victory, struck hard. Marta admitted quietly, "We were told they would strip us of our dignity, but it is our own leaders who lied." No one contradicted her. Later, back in the enclosure, the women sat together in silence, towels draped over shoulders, damp hair clinging to cheeks. Their uniforms, though still threadbare, smelled faintly cleaner. Erica rubbed the soap between her fingers again and again, as if trying to prove it was real. She whispered, "This means something. I don't know what, but it does." The shower scene did not erase the humiliation of captivity, nor did it suddenly make their future secure. But it was a turning point. For the first time, they glimpsed that survival might not mean degradation. It might, in its own limited way, include dignity, even if it came through something as simple as soap and water. That night, lying on straw mats beneath the watchful eyes of guards, the women replayed the moment in their minds. Some cried softly, unable to reconcile fear with relief. Others stared upward, wondering what else they had been wrong about. The water had not only washed their bodies, it had rinsed away the edges of the lies they carried. But the weight of this experience could not be measured fully without comparing it to the poisonous propaganda they had grown up with, which painted their captors in the darkest colors imaginable. From childhood, these women had been raised on carefully crafted images. In schoolrooms, teachers spoke of enemies who wanted to crush Germany and enslave its people. Posters showed Americans as savages with exaggerated features, brutal and wild, eager to tear down everything German. Even in their auxiliary service, during late-night shifts at switchboards, the radio still crackled with speeches describing Allied cruelty. The message was always the same. Surrender would mean ruin. But the camp at Bad Aibling told a different story. The Americans didn't greet them with hatred. They processed them like inventory, gave them bread and watery stew, and most astonishingly, soap and showers. The disconnect gnawed at their minds. If everything they had been told about the Allies was false, then what else in their world had been a lie? One evening, sitting on the straw inside the enclosure, Marta voiced the question none of them wanted to say out loud. Why would they treat us this way? Why not punish us? Erica shook her head. Maybe they're mocking us, making us think that we're safe.
No, another girl interjected, softer. If they wanted to kill us, they wouldn't waste water. They follow rules. The idea of rules was foreign to them in this context. They had been taught that war was merciless, that enemies would abandon any sense of honor. Yet here, under the guard of young men who looked barely older than themselves, they began to see that the Americans acted according to regulations. They had heard of the Geneva Convention, but it had always seemed distant, something only officers cared about. Now those international promises were shaping the course of their captivity. Still, suspicion lingered. Propaganda had not just frightened them, it had shaped their identity. To let go of that fear meant letting go of part of what they thought was truth. And so they wavered. One moment, they accepted the showers as proof of American order. The next, they whispered that the kindness was temporary. One night, as the guards handed out bread, Katerina held hers tightly and said under her breath, "They must want us alive for something. Nobody does this without reason." Her words captured the unease of the group. Was this treatment genuine, or did it mask some hidden purpose? The irony was that the Americans were not thinking so deeply about it. For them, the procedures were standard. Delousing, medical checks, showers, food rations. These were all written into army manuals. It was less about compassion and more about sanitation and discipline. Yet from the women's perspective, every detail carried meaning. Every bar of soap and cup of stew became a symbol of unexpected humanity. One afternoon, the women overheard two guards speaking in English. The only phrase that stood out was "same rations, Army standard." The interpreter later explained that prisoners were meant to receive food comparable to what U.S. soldiers ate. The women stared in disbelief. Marta whispered, "They feed us like their own." The realization was too large to fit into the picture of the brutal enemy they had grown up fearing. The contrast weighed heavily on them. On the road south, they had seen starving German civilians, skeletal refugees begging for scraps. Yet here, inside a prisoner enclosure, they were handed bread and soap. It was a paradox they struggled to reconcile. The propaganda had painted captivity as the worst fate imaginable, but in truth, it offered them more stability than the collapsing Reich outside. This dissonance sparked quiet reflection. For the first time, some began to question not only what they had been told about the enemy, but also what they had been told about their own nation. If the Americans obeyed rules, why hadn't their own leaders done the same? Why had they been forced to march south on empty stomachs while cities burned? The questions had no easy answers. For now, they sat in silence after each day's routine, heads lowered, thoughts circling. The showers had marked the first fracture in the wall of propaganda, and every meal, every guard rotation widened the crack. The women did not suddenly see the Americans as saviors. That leap was too far. But they began to understand that defeat did not mean annihilation, and that the truth was far more complicated than the lies they had lived under. But while this realization grew slowly, it was in the daily routines of camp life, the rations, the inspections, the endless structure, that the true shape of their captivity began to form. By the second week of captivity, the shock of surrender had dulled into routine. Life inside the American enclosure followed a rhythm that was both foreign and oddly predictable. At sunrise, the guards whistled, and the women were lined up for head counts. The roll call was brisk. Names checked against lists, faces scanned, numbers tallied. Then came the distribution of food. Metal tins filled with porridge in the morning, a slice of bread at midday, stew or beans by evening. It was plain, sometimes watery, sometimes salted too heavily, but compared to the gnawing hunger of the retreat, it was almost abundant. The camp itself was a patchwork of tents, barbed wire, and wooden guard towers. Inside, the prisoners were grouped in sections, divided by rope barriers. Straw bedding lay on the ground, thin and scratchy, but it was better than the open road. Latrines were dug at the far end, covered with canvas for privacy. Buckets of water were brought in regularly, sometimes with soap rationed out again. Everything was designed for order, efficiency, and hygiene. To the women, this order carried a strange double edge. On one hand, it spared them the chaos of the outside world. There were no bombs falling, no sudden marches in the middle of the night, no collapsing front lines. On the other, it reinforced their captivity. Every whistle, every head count, every scheduled meal reminded them that freedom had ended. Erica once murmured to Marta as they sat eating beans from a dented tin, "We live like clockwork now, everything at their time, their way." Marta, chewing slowly, replied, "But at least we live." The guards rotated in shifts, faces changing every few days. Some were standoffish, speaking little, their expressions carved in stone. Others seemed barely older than the prisoners, fumbling with German phrases or grinning awkwardly when their words came out wrong. One guard, a tall farm boy from Iowa, tried handing out bread with a broken bitteschön, which made several of the women laugh despite themselves. It was the first time since surrender that laughter had slipped into the enclosure. Nurses visited too, checking for lice, distributing ointments, treating fevers. Their presence was unsettling. Gentle hands touching arms and foreheads, administering medicine instead of pain. For years, the women had been told that the enemy would treat them with cruelty, strip them of dignity, and leave them to rot. Instead, they found themselves subject to a kind of mechanical care. It was not affection, not kindness, but it was attention, and that was enough to spark confusion. At night, the camp quieted. The prisoners whispered to each other, voices low so guards wouldn't overhear. They spoke of home, of mothers and siblings scattered by the war,
of fathers never returned from the front. They argued over whether their captivity was a curse or a hidden form of mercy. Katerina, still bitter, said one night, "They want us weak. That is why they keep us here, fed but useless." Anna countered softly, "If they wanted us useless, they would have left us to starve on the road. This is different." The truth sat somewhere in between. The Americans did not see them as equals, but they did not see them as garbage either. They were prisoners, subject to rules, part of a vast system of war that had swallowed millions. From time to time, rumors drifted through the enclosure. Some came from interpreters, others from overheard snippets of English. There was talk of prisoner transfers to larger camps, of the Red Cross inspecting conditions, of some captives being shipped overseas. Each rumor sparked a fresh wave of anxiety. Would they be moved? Would they vanish into the belly of another war machine? None of the women knew, and the not knowing gnawed at them as much as the captivity itself. Still, there were small mercies. A guard occasionally tossed a cigarette butt into the enclosure, and those who smoked shared it greedily. A nurse once handed Marta an extra crust of bread when she noticed her thin frame. Little gestures that did not erase the wire fences, but softened the sharpness of captivity. Day by day, the women learned the contours of this new life. The camp was not freedom, but neither was it the terror they had imagined. It was something harder to name. A gray zone where survival mixed with shame, where order replaced chaos, and where each routine task, head count, rations, inspections, reminded them of a war that was finished, yet still pressed its weight upon them. But the camp itself was only the setting. It was in the fleeting human encounters, the brief words, the exchanged glances, the quiet gestures, that their understanding of this strange captivity deepened. For all the order and structure of camp life, what lingered most were the moments when the prisoners and their captors brushed against each other in ways that were unscripted. These were not the official routines of rations or roll calls, but the quiet, almost accidental interactions that reminded both sides they were human. It began with small things. A soldier dropping a piece of bread on the ground, and instead of discarding it, handing it to one of the women with a shrug, as if to say, "Food is food."
Another time, a guard caught two prisoners whispering in line, and rather than snapping at them, simply muttered quiet in clumsy German that was awkward but not hostile. These small breaks from strict regulation stood out sharply because they felt genuine, unfiltered. One afternoon, Marta watched as a young American soldier leaned against the fence, smoking. He noticed the women staring and, after a pause, tossed the half-finished cigarette into the enclosure. Several rushed for it, passing it hand to hand, each taking a desperate drag. The guard watched, his face unreadable, then turned away. To him, it might have been nothing. To them, it was a reminder of a world outside the wire, where small indulgences still existed. There were words, too, when language allowed. Some of the guards spoke fragments of German picked up during the campaign. Essen, they said as they handed out food. Schnell, when urging the line to move faster. Sometimes it sounded harsh, but sometimes it carried the awkward rhythm of someone trying to communicate beyond orders. One evening, Erica gathered courage to speak back. A guard was struggling with the word for blanket. She pointed to the pile and said it slowly. Decca. He repeated it, his accent bending the word oddly, and she corrected him, laughing softly. He grinned, shrugged, and tried again. For a few moments, the war, the wire, the uniforms, all of it faded. It was just two young people fumbling over words. The nurses offered another kind of encounter. Unlike the guards, they sometimes looked directly into the women's eyes as they worked. When one girl developed a fever, an American nurse knelt beside her, pressed a hand to her forehead, and spoke softly in English. The words were not understood, but the tone was clear. Reassurance. The woman was given aspirin and water, checked again the next morning. She survived. That survival owed not to chance, but to care, and it rattled the prisoners more than the showers had. Yet not every moment was gentle.
there were times when frustration slipped through. A guard, irritated at the slowness of the line, barked orders with a sharpness that made the women flinch. Another confiscated a trinket one of them had hidden, tossing it into a bag without explanation. These incidents reminded them that they were still captives, their fate controlled by strangers. But even the harsher moments were different from what they had been taught to expect. There was no deliberate cruelty, no calculated humiliation. Instead, there was impatience, weariness, the marks of soldiers who had seen too much war and wanted it over. The women discussed these encounters endlessly. At night, they replayed each word, each gesture, weighing them against the propaganda that still echoed in their minds. Katerina remained skeptical. "Don't trust them," she said firmly. "A smile can hide anything." But Marta shook her head. "Maybe not everything is a trick. Maybe sometimes it's just people." The tension between fear and recognition grew stronger with each passing day. The Americans did not treat them as equals, but neither did they treat them as monsters. That gray area was confusing, even painful, because it forced the women to confront a possibility they had long rejected. The enemy was human, too. For some, this realization brought a kind of fragile hope. If the Americans could show small acts of humanity, even in victory, perhaps the future would not be only darkness. For others, it deepened their shame. To see compassion in the faces of those they had been told were brutes was to confront how deeply they had been misled. But these fleeting encounters, whether kind or stern, became the fabric of their days in captivity. Each one chipped away at fear, reshaping it into something harder to name: confusion, humility, reluctant respect. But the real turning point came not from the guards or the nurses, but from within the prisoners themselves, as they began to reflect on what all of this meant for their own understanding of the war and their place in it. By the third week, the women no longer trembled at every whistle or command. The fear had not vanished, but it had shifted. What gnawed at them now was not the threat of violence, but the slow realization that everything they had believed was crumbling. The Americans had not starved them, beaten them, or paraded them in shame. Instead, they had been given rations, blankets, medical care, and soap. The shock of this truth weighed heavier than the wire fences. At night, when the camp quieted and the guards paced lazily under the glow of lanterns, the women whispered their thoughts into the dark. Marta often led the conversations, her voice steady, almost detached. "We were told surrender would be worse than death," she said one evening, pulling her damp hair back into a braid. "But we are here, alive, cleaner than we've been in months. They lied to us." Katerina bristled. "Lied, yes, but don't think they are friends. We are still behind their wire." "No one said they are friends," Marta replied, "but they are not monsters either. That matters." The group fell silent. They knew she was right. It was a thought they had resisted because admitting it meant admitting that their leaders had deceived them for years. The sense of betrayal stung worse than the loss of freedom. Erica, who had clung tightly to fear, began to soften. She spoke of her father, who had fought on the Eastern Front and never returned. If he had been captured here, not there, maybe he would still be alive, she whispered. The others murmured agreement. Everyone knew the difference between capture in the West and in the East. The stories from the East were horrific, but here, under American guard, life continued. Restricted, but survivable. Days turned into markers of thought. Each meal was a reminder of rules followed. Each inspection was proof that order, not chaos, governed their fate. Slowly, the women began to understand that captivity under rules carried its own strange dignity. They were not free, but neither were they destroyed. The showers, in hindsight, grew larger in their memory. What at first felt like humiliation now appeared as a symbol. Soap and hot water had become a dividing line between what they had feared and what was real. Marta put it plainly once. The water showed us the truth. Not kindness, not cruelty.
just humanity following rules. But the reflection was not without pain. Shame seeped in. Shame for the years spent believing lies. Shame for the hatred they had felt toward people they had never met. Shame for realizing that the enemy had treated them with more consistency than their own leaders had given civilians in the final days. Some tried to resist this self-examination. Katerina insisted that it was weakness to admit such thoughts. We cannot praise them. They still hold us captive. But her protests rang hollow, even to herself. She too had felt the relief of soap, the steadying calm of routine meals, the touch of a nurse's hand checking her pulse. Denial was becoming harder to sustain. The women began to carry themselves differently. Not proudly, but with a cautious awareness that they were more than victims of defeat. They were witnesses to a truth their fellow countrymen outside might never grasp. The enemy could obey rules even in victory, and that knowledge, though small, carried weight. On one particularly cold night, Anna spoke softly as the others lay awake. "When this ends, if it ever does, I will tell my children that the Americans gave me soap, that they made me wash when I thought I would die. Maybe that will mean something." Her words drifted into the silence, heavy with the promise of memory. In their reflections, the women found no easy answers, but they found a kind of clarity. War had stripped them of certainty. Propaganda had filled them with fear. But captivity had given them a truth they could not ignore. But their story was not only about reflection, it was also about what came after, when the showers and the rations became more than procedure, and instead a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. When the gates finally opened weeks later and the women were transferred to a larger prisoner camp, the memory they carried with them was not the barbed wire or the head counts. It was the soap. It was the showers. That first surreal moment, when what they expected to be the end of their lives turned out to be nothing more than hygiene. In the years that followed, when they spoke of their captivity, that detail always surfaced. It was a symbol, a reminder that survival often wears the mask of the ordinary.
For many, the shower was the first crack in the wall of propaganda they had lived behind. They had been told for years that surrender to the Americans meant brutality. Yet it was the Americans who gave them soap, who enforced hygiene, who provided food at regular hours. These weren't acts of generosity, they were protocol, regulations written into army handbooks. But to the women, stripped of illusions and facing the unknown, they felt like a revelation. Marta would later recall how she pressed the bar of soap to her face, inhaling the sharp scent, unable to believe that it was real. Erica remembered the steam rising from the pipes, the fear that it might be gas, and the flood of relief when it wasn't. Anna said she cried not because she was humiliated, but because she felt, for the first time in weeks, clean. The detail might have been small, but it had the weight of survival. The experience left them with a lesson that grew clearer as years passed. Dignity is not always found in triumph or pride. Sometimes it comes in the simplest acts. Warm water on skin, a shared cigarette butt, a nurse's hand checking a fever. Those moments reminded them that humanity can endure even when nations fall apart. It also forced them to confront their own beliefs. If the enemy could follow rules, if they could treat captives with order instead of cruelty, then perhaps everything they had been told was wrong. That realization brought shame, but also growth. They had been deceived, yes, but in captivity, they had also been given the chance to see the truth with their own eyes. When the war ended and some of them eventually returned home, the story of the showers became part of their private histories. Not everyone wanted to hear it. In bombed-out towns, surrounded by grief and loss, tales of Americans giving prisoners soap sounded trivial, even absurd. But to those who had lived it, it was not trivial at all. It was proof that survival could come in forms no one expected.
In the long years that followed, the women carried the lesson with them. Humanity is tested in extremes, but it can show itself in the smallest gestures. A bar of soap, a bowl of stew, a guard who tries awkwardly to say blanket in German. Those details mattered because they reminded the prisoners that even in war, rules and decency could still hold power. For those who survived, the memory of that first shower stayed vivid. It was not just about water and soap, it was about perspective. It was the moment when they realized that defeat was not the end of being human. It was the moment they understood that survival often comes in ways you least expect, and that dignity, once thought lost, can be restored in something as simple as washing away the dirt of war. The moral they drew was clear. Never let lies define how you see others, and never underestimate the weight of small mercies. Even in captivity, even in defeat, there can be a spark of humanity strong enough to break through fear. So when we look back at their story today, it reminds us that history isn't just shaped by battles and treaties. It is shaped by the small human moments that outlast the gunfire. Soap and showers may not appear in official records of the war, but for those women, it was the memory that defined their captivity. And that leaves us with a question worth carrying forward in our own lives. When conflict or hardship threatens to strip others of dignity, will we choose cruelty, or will we choose something as simple and as powerful as giving them the chance to wash and begin again?